Iron. We usually think of it as this absolutely essential vital mineral, right? It gives us energy, it keeps our blood oxygenated. But what actually happens when the body's iron communication system completely breaks down? What happens when the biological gates that regulate how much iron we absorb are just left permanently open? Well, today in this explainer, we're diving deep into hemochromatosis. It's a truly fascinating yet potentially deadly disease where the human body unknowingly poisons itself with the exact same element it needs to survive.
Here is a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the burden of iron, jump into the genetics of that broken iron gate we just mentioned, and then zoom out to the systemic clinical manifestations. Finally, we'll wrap up with the diagnostic approach, family screening protocols, and management.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the burden of iron. Before we get into the weeds, we really need to establish what this condition actually is.
So, hemochromatosis is an inherited iron storage disorder. But listen, it isn't just a matter of someone eating too much iron-rich food. It's fundamentally an issue of inappropriately high cellular release of iron and excess of intestinal absorption. In a normal body, iron loss perfectly matches iron absorption, usually about 1 to 1.5 milligrams a day. But in hemochromatosis, the body is constantly absorbing way more than it needs, sometimes upwards of 4 milligrams a day. Over time, all this excess iron has absolutely nowhere to go, so it leads to toxic deposition in your parenchymal cells, eventually causing cellular injury, tissue fibrosis, and if left unchecked, complete organ failure.
You might be surprised to learn just how prevalent this genetic anomaly is. In populations of Northern European or Celtic extraction, about 1 in 10 people are heterozygous carriers of this mutation. 1 in 10. That is a massive 10% of that population. Now, obviously, not all carriers actually develop the disease. It's an autosomal recessive trait, meaning you generally need 2 copies of the mutated gene to actually get sick. But it definitely shows us that the genetic seed for this disease is incredibly common, which makes it a really critical public health consideration.
So let's move on to Section 2, Genetics and Pathophysiology, or as I like to call it, the broken iron gate. Let's look at the microscopic origins here. We do see some genetic heterogeneity with this disease. The vast majority of cases, we're talking 80 to 90% in Northern European populations, are HFE-related, which we classify as type 1. This is driven primarily by a specific mutation called C282Y. But then on the flip side, we have the non-HFE-related types. Now, these are rare, they can affect all populations, and they sometimes present very early in life, which is known as juvenile hemochromatosis. These are driven by mutations in entirely different genes, like hemojuvelin or TFR2. But the absolute key takeaway here is this: whether it's the common HFE type or the rare non-HFE type, they all ultimately disrupt the exact same iron-regulating pathway in the liver.
Let's zero in on that primary genetic culprit for a second, the C282Y mutation on the HFE gene, which sits tightly linked to the HLA-A locus on chromosome 6p. Normally, the HFE protein has to reach the cell surface to do its job, but this specific mutation completely ruins its ability to interact with other necessary proteins. So the mutant HFE protein just gets trapped inside the cell. It never makes it to the surface, and because of that, a really critical signal is just lost.
So what happens when that signal goes missing? Let's use a quick analogy. Think of your body's iron regulation as a high-security facility. You've got this protein called hepcidin, and he's basically your guard. It's a liver-derived hormone that communicates your body's iron requirements. Then you have ferroportin, which is the gate. It physically releases iron from your intestinal cells and macrophages into your bloodstream. Normally, when you have enough iron, the hepcidin guard shuts the ferroportin gate. But because of that HFE mutation we just talked about, hepcidin production drops off a cliff. The guard is essentially missing from his post. And without the guard, that ferroportin gate is just left permanently open. And the consequence of that is pretty severe because the gate is wide open. The enterocytes lining your intestines are continuously pumping dietary iron straight into your bloodstream. It completely overwhelms the body's normal homeostatic requirements. The iron just keeps flowing in, day after day, meal after meal, with nothing to stop it.
Which brings us to Section 3, Systemic Clinical Manifestations. The iron overflow. Let's see what happens to a body when this overflow continues unchecked for decades. I want you to really think about this for a second. If the body literally has no mechanism to excrete excess iron, where does it all go? Well, it physically deposits itself into your tissues.
In advanced disease, a patient's body might contain 20 grams or more of excess iron. It isn't just floating freely in the blood, it's stuffing itself right into the parenchymal cells. This massive iron load disrupts lysosomes, it causes lipid peroxidation of cellular organelles, and it stimulates collagen synthesis. And all of that leads to massive, irreversible tissue fibrosis.
And because of that fibrosis, we see a really tragic cascade of symptoms. In the joints, it causes severe, painful arthropathy. In the skin, increased melanin and iron create this characteristic slate gray or metallic bronzing. In the pancreas, the iron directly damages the islets, leading to diabetes in about 65% of advanced cases, which is why this was historically called bronze diabetes. In the heart, it causes sudden congestive heart failure and super dangerous arrhythmias. And in the pituitary gland, iron deposition severely impairs hormone production, leading to hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism, loss of libido, and testicular atrophy. It's systemic. It affects everything.
But make no mistake, the liver is ground zero. Early on, the iron deposits in the periportal parenchymal cells. As it builds up, it activates hepatic stellate cells, which start laying down fibrous scarred tissue. Ultimately, this leads to a macronodular cirrhosis. And why is that so critical? Because once a patient develops cirrhosis, they become highly susceptible to hepatocellular carcinoma, liver cancer. In fact, it is the most common cause of death in treated patients who already have cirrhosis.
Okay, so the crucial point here is, how do we actually find this iron before it ruins the liver and destroys the rest of the body? Let's transition over to Section 4, the diagnostic approach.
If we compare normal iron markers to a symptomatic hemochromatosis patient, the differences are just staggering. Take transferrin saturation, which measures how much iron is bound to the transport protein in your blood. Normally, that's sitting between 22 and 45%. In hemochromatosis, it skyrockets to anywhere from 50 to 100%. Then look at serum ferritin, which is an index of your total body iron stores. A normal male might top out around 250 micrograms per liter. A symptomatic patient, they can have levels between 1,000 and 6,000. So a fasting transferrin saturation over 45% and a ferritin over 1,000 are absolute massive red flags that scream for genetic testing.
Once we suspect a disease, we obviously need to evaluate the liver. Now, historically, a liver biopsy was the absolute gold standard to check for cirrhosis and measure hepatic iron. And while it's still highly reliable, modern medicine has really shifted. Thanks to the widespread availability of genetic testing for that C282Y mutation and incredible advancements in MRI technology, we can now accurately measure the density of iron in the liver entirely non-invasively. Today, a biopsy is often only needed if we strongly suspect severe fibrosis or cirrhosis, based on heavily elevated ferritin and abnormal liver enzymes.
All right, moving on to Section 5, family screening protocols. Because this is a genetic disorder, diagnosing one patient isn't the end of the line. It's actually just the beginning of protecting an entire lineage.
We really have to frame this as a necessary medical detective hunt. We know that up to 70% of untreated patients develop their very first symptoms between ages 40 and 60. But if we can catch the disease in their relatives during that silent pre-cirrhotic phase, we can completely alter their fate. So the question is, who needs to be tested?
The protocol is pretty straightforward. First, you absolutely must test all adult first-degree relatives of the patient for both the C282Y and H63D mutations. Second, you assess their transferrin saturation and serum ferritin to see if that iron overload process has actually started. And third, you initiate therapy early if those stores are elevated. But a quick note here to reassure you, testing children under 18 is practically unnecessary unless both parents are confirmed carriers, simply because it takes decades for this iron accumulation to really build up.
And that brings us perfectly to our final section, Section 6, phlebotomy and management. How do we treat a disease where the body has too much of a toxic element hidden away inside its organs? Well, we use a surprisingly ancient medical technique. 500. I want you to focus on this number for a second. 500 milliliters. That is the amount of blood removed during a single phlebotomy session, which is essentially just a standard blood donation. Because iron is heavily concentrated in our red blood cells, removing 500 milliliters of blood extracts about 200 to 250 milligrams of iron directly from the body. It literally forces the body to pull that trapped, toxic iron out of the liver and heart just to make new red blood cells. It's incredibly effective.
In the initial phase, a patient might need this 500 milliliter phlebotomy weekly, or sometimes even twice weekly, which can take 1 to 2 entire years to clear the backlog. The goal is to drop that serum ferritin to 100 micrograms per liter or less. Once they hit that, they enter a maintenance phase of about 1 phlebotomy every 3 months. Now, for patients who just can't tolerate phlebotomy, iron chelating agents can be used to medically bind and excrete the iron. But crucially, during all of this management, the patient absolutely must severely curtail or entirely eliminate alcohol. Consuming alcohol multiplies the risk of cirrhosis and hemochromatosis patients nearly 10-fold.
I do want to end the clinical side on a highly optimistic note. Quote, "The life expectancy of homozygotes treated before the development of cirrhosis is normal." Think about that. If we catch this broken iron gate early, and we simply remove the blot before the liver scars, a potentially deadly genetic curse is completely neutralized.
I'll leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. If a patient is born with this mutation, and that ferroportin gate is stuck wide open from day one, constantly absorbing excess iron, why does it take 40 to 60 years for the organs to finally fail? It really makes you marvel at the incredible, albeit temporary, resilience of the human body to sequester and hide toxins away just to protect us. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking questions.